Chapter 5 of the Gadfly. That afternoon, Arthur felt the need of a long walk. He entrusted his luggage to a fellow student and went to Leghorn on foot. That day was damp and cloudy, but not cold, and the low, level country seemed to him fairer than he had ever known it to look before. He had a sense of delight in the soft elasticity of the wet grass under his feet, and in the shy, wondering eyes of the wild spring flowers by the roadside. In a thorn acacia bush at the edge of a little strip of wood, a bird was building a nest, and flew up as he passed with a startled cry and a quick fluttering of brown wings. He tried to keep his mind fixed upon the devout meditations proper to the eve of Good Friday, but thoughts of Montanelli and Gemma got so much in the way of his devotional exercise that at last he gave up the attempt and allowed his fancy to drift away to the wonders and the glories of coming insurrection, and to the part in it that he had allotted to his two idols. The padre was to be the leader, the apostle, the prophet before whose sacred wrath the powers of darkness were to flee, at whose feet the young defenders of liberty were to learn afresh the old doctrines, the old truths, then in their new and unimagined significance. And Gemma? Oh, Gemma, she would fight at the barricades. She was made of the clay of which heroines are molded. She would be the perfect comrade, the maiden undefiled and unafraid of whom so many poets had dreamed. She would stand beside him shoulder to shoulder, rejoicing under the winged death storm, and they would die together, perhaps at the moment of victory. Without doubt there would be a victory. Of his love he would tell her nothing. He would say no word that might disturb her peace or spoil her tranquil sense of comradeship. She was to him a holy thing, a spotless victim to be laid upon the altar as a burnt offering for the deliverance of the people. And who was it that he should enter into the white sanctuary of a soul that knew no other love than God and Italy? God and Italy. There came a sudden drop from the clouds as he entered the great, dreary house of the Street of Palaces, and Julia's butler, immaculate, calm, and politely disapproving as ever, confronted him upon the stairs. "Good evening, Gibbons. Are my brothers in?" "Mr. Thomas is in, sir, and Mrs. Burton. They are in the drawing-room." Arthur went in with a dull sense of oppression. What a dismal house it was! The flood of life seemed to roll past and leave it always just above high water mark. Nothing in it ever changed, neither the people nor the family portraits, nor the heavy furniture and ugly plate, nor the vulgar ostentation of riches, nor the lifeless aspect of everything. Even the flowers on the brass stands looked like painted metal flowers that had never known the stirring of young sap within them in the warm spring days. Julia, dressed for dinner, was waiting for visitors in the drawing-room, which was to her the center of existence. Might have sat for a fashion plate just as she was, with her wooden smile and flaxen ringlets, and the lapdog on her knee. "How do you do, Arthur?" she said stiffly, giving him the tips of her fingers for a moment, and then transferred them to a more congenial contact of the lapdog's silken coat. I hope you are quite well and have made satisfactory progress at college." Arthur murmured the first commonplace that he could think of at the moment, and then relapsed into uncomfortable silence. The arrival of James in his most pompous mood and accompanied by a stiff, elderly shipping agent did not improve matters, and when Gibbons announced that dinner was served, Arthur rose with a little sigh of relief. "I won't come to dinner, Julia. If you'll excuse me, I will go to my room." "You're overdoing that fasting, my boy," said Thomas. "I am sure you might make yourself ill." "Oh, no. Good night." In the corridor, Arthur met the under-housemaid and asked her to knock at his door at 6 a.m. "The signorina is going to church?" "Yes. Good night, Teresa." He went into his room. It had belonged to his mother, and the alcove opposite the window had been fitted during her long illness as an oratory. A great crucifix on the black pedestal occupied the middle of the altar, and before it hung a little Roman lamp. This was the room where she had died. Her portrait was on the wall beside the bed, and on the table stood a china bowl which had been hers, filled with a great bunch of her favorite violets. It was just a year since her death, and the Italian servants had not forgotten her. He took out of his portmanteau a framed picture, carefully wrapped up. It was a crayon portrait of Montanelli, which had come from Rome only a few days before. He was unwrapping this precious treasure when Julia's page brought in a supper tray, on which the old Italian cook, who had served Gladys before the harsh new mistress came, had placed such little delicacies as she considered her dear signorino might permit himself to eat without infringing on the rules of the church. Arthur refused everything but a piece of bread, and the page, a nephew of Gibbons, lately arrived from England, grinned significantly as he carried out the tray. He had already joined the Protestant camp in the servants' hall. Arthur went out into the alcove and knelt down before the crucifix, trying to compose his mind in the proper attitude for prayer and meditation. But this he found difficult to accomplish. He had, as Thomas said, rather overdone the Lenten privations, and they had gone to his head like strong wine. Little quivers of excitement went down his back, and the crucifix swam in the misty cloud before his eyes. It was only after a long litany, mechanically repeated, that he succeeded in recalling his wandering imagination to the mystery of the atonement. At last, sheer physical weariness conquered the feverish agitation of his nerves, and he lay down to sleep in a calm and peaceful mood, free from all unquiet or disturbing thoughts. He was fast asleep when the sharp, impatient knock came at his door. "Ah, Teresa," he said. He thought, turning over lazily. The knock was repeated, and he awoke with a violent start. "Signorino, signorino," cried a man's voice in Italian. "Get up, for the love of God." Arthur jumped out of bed. "What is the matter? Who is it?" "It is I, Gian Battista. Get up, quick, for Our Lady's sake." Arthur hurriedly dressed and opened the door. As he stared in perplexity at the coachman's pale, terrified face, the sound of trampling feet and clanking metal came along the corridor. He suddenly realized the truth. "For me?" he asked coolly. "For you. Oh, signorino, make haste. What have you to hide? See, I have nothing to hide. Do my brothers know?" The first uniform appeared at the turn of the passage. "The signor has been called, and the house is awake. Alas, what a misfortune, what a terrible misfortune! And on Good Friday! Holy saints, have pity! Giambattista burst into tears. Arthur moved a few steps forward and waited for the gendarmes who came clattering along, following a shivering crowd of servants in various impromptu costumes. As the soldiers surrounded Arthur, the master and mistress of the house brought up the rear of the strange procession, he in a dressing gown and slippers, she in a long peignoir with her hair in curl papers. There is, sure, another flood toward, and these couples are coming to the ark. Here comes a pair of very strange beasts. The quotation flashed across Arthur's mind as he looked at the grotesque figures. He checked a laugh with a sense of its jarring incongruity. This was a time for worthier thoughts. Ave Maria, Regina Coeli, he whispered, and turned his eyes away, that the bobbing of Julia's curl papers might not again tempt him to levity. Kindly explain to me, said Mr. Burton, approaching the officer of the gendarmerie. What is the meaning of this violent intrusion to a private house? I warn you that, unless you are prepared to furnish me with a satisfactory explanation, I shall feel bound to complain to the English ambassador. I presume, replied the officer stiffly, that you will recognize this as a sufficient explanation. The English ambassador certainly will. He pulled out a warrant for the arrest of Arthur Burton, student of philosophy, and, handing it to James, added coldly, If you wish for any further explanation, you had better apply in person to the chief of police. Julia snatched the paper from her husband, glanced over it, and flew at Arthur like nothing else in the world but a fashionable lady in a rage. So it is you that have disgraced the family, she screamed, setting all the rabble in town gaping and staring as if the thing were a show. So you have turned jailbird now, with all your piety. It's what we might have expected from that popish woman's child. You must not speak to a prisoner in a foreign language, madam, said the officer interrupted, but his remonstrance was hardly audible under the torrent of Julia's vociferous English. Just what we might have expected. Fasting and prayer and saintly meditation, all this is what was underneath it. I thought that would be the end of it. Dr. Warren had once compared Julia to a salad into which the cook had upset a vinegar cruet. The sound of her thin, hard voice set Arthur's teeth on edge, and the simile suddenly popped into his memory. There is no use in this kind of talk, he said. You need not be afraid of any unpleasantness. Everyone will understand that you are all quite innocent. I suppose, gentlemen, that you want to search my things. I have nothing to hide. When the gendarmes ransacked his room, reading his letters, examining his college papers, and turning out drawers and boxes, he sat waiting on the edge of the bed, a little flushed with excitement, but in no way distressed. The search did not disquiet him. He had always burned letters which could possibly compromise anyone, and beyond a few manuscript verses, half revolutionary, half mystical, and 2 or 3 numbers of Young Italy, The officers found nothing to repay him for their trouble. Julia, after a long resistance, yielded to the entreaties of her brother-in-law and went back to bed. Sweeping past Arthur with magnificent disdain, James meekly followed. When they had left the room, Thomas, who all this while had been tramping up and down, trying to look indifferent, approached the officer and asked permission to speak to the prisoner. Receiving a nod in answer, he went up to Arthur and muttered in a rather husky voice, "I say, this is infernally awkward business. I am very sorry about it." Arthur looked up with a face as serene as a summer morning. "You have always been good to me," he said. "There's nothing to be sorry about. I shall be safe enough." "Look here, Arthur," Thomas said. Thomas gave his mustache a hard pull and plunged headfirst into the awkward question. "Is this anything to do with money? Because if it is, With money? Why, no. What could it have to do with... Well, then is it some political tomfoolery? I thought so. Well, don't you get all down in the mouth. And never mind all that stuff Julia talks. It's only her spiteful tongue. And if you want help, cash or anything, let me know, will you?" Arthur held out his hand in silence, and Thomas left the room with a carefully made-up expression of unconcern that rendered his face more stolid than ever. The officers, meanwhile, had finished their search, and the one in charge requested Arthur to put on his outdoor clothes. He obeyed at once and turned to leave the room, then stopped with a sudden hesitation. It seemed hard to take leave of his mother's oratory in the presence of these officials. "Have you any objection to leaving the room for a moment?" he asked. "You see, I cannot escape, and there is nothing to conceal." "I'm sorry, but it's forbidden to leave a prisoner alone." "Very well, it doesn't matter." He went into the alcove and, kneeling down, kissed the feet and pedestal of the crucifix, whispering softly, "Lord, keep me faithful unto death." When he rose, the officer was standing by his table, examining Montanelli's portrait. "Is this a relative of yours?" he asked. "No, it is my confessor and the new bishop of Brisighella." On the staircase, the Italian servants were waiting, anxious and sorrowful. They all loved Arthur for his own sake and his mother's, and they crowded round him, kissing his hands and dress with a passionate grief. Giambattista stood by, and tears dripping down his grey mustache. None of the Burtons had come to take leave of him. Their coldness accentuated the tenderness and sympathy of the servants, and Arthur was near to breaking down as he pressed the hands held out to him. "Goodbye, Giambattista. Kiss the little ones for me. Goodbye, Teresa. Pray for me, all of you, and God keep you. Goodbye, goodbye." He ran hastily downstairs to the front door. A moment later, only a little group of silent men and sobbing women stood on the doorstep, watching the carriage as it drove away.